the rattling of chains, the moaning of ghosts, the mist coming in from the terrifying moors tell us that we have entered the most terrifying of panels, and that is Pelgrane Press's horror role-playing masterclass. Let us begin by introducing our horrifying participants. The creator of The Fall of Delta Green, Night's Black Agents, Trail of Cthulhu, and Day After Ragnarok, my podcasting partner in crime, Kenneth Hite.
Hey! Woo!
Contributor to Cthulhu Confidential and the Black Star Magic Sourcebook for the Yellow King role-playing game, friend of the Dream Clown, Ruth Tillman. Prolific.
I would have brought my ghoul mask, prolific unmuter.
Yes, the most terrifying thing, the mute button.
Oh, the silent films like Nosferatu.
Yeah. Prolific master of real-time research, known for such game products as Cthulhu City, Eyes of the Stone Thief, and the difficult half of the Dracula dossier, author of the novels The Gutter Prayer and The Shadow Saint, it's the Gaelic mensch, Gareth Hanrahan.
Hello.
And I am Robin D. Laws. I'm responsible for such horror games as the Yellow King role-playing game, The Esoterrorists, and Fear Itself, and the terrifying works of fiction, New Tales of the Yellow Sign, and The Missing and the Lost. So we are here to give you advanced tips on playing horror, how to create the mood that people expect within the capacious umbrella of the horror genre. And before we start, the most obvious point you have to make about horror, I'll make it so that my fellow panelists do not, it is the genre that most requires safety tools, discussions with your players, buy-in, and I think even when you have all of those things, also sort of a similar sensibility as to your fondness for horror and your expectations of what will happen within the horror genre. So make sure you're up to date on the latest safety tools and the ones that make sense for your group. So having said that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to provide their top tip for running games in the horror genre. If everyone's internet was to cut out in 10 minutes, what is the one thing you would want them to know about horror? And let's start with Ruth.
Well, there's always the horror of being the first person called on for the answer. But my tip for actually running a game, a horror game, my top tip would probably be based somewhat on those safety rules that Robin actually mentioned. Know what your group is about. Know what that sweet spot is going to be between something that will leave them thinking and talking about it for weeks to come and going too far. And then push up, not to the edge exactly, but get that right in that sweet spot. And learning that for your group is going to be some time and challenge. And so you won't always get it right. But when you do, it makes the absolute perfect horror game that still has everybody shivering years later.
Gar.
I think horror is a really, really wide genre, so work out what particular sub-form of horror you're going for and make sure it's the same one your players expect. If your players come in and they expect a, fairly sort of intellectual Cthulhu Mythos game of investigation with the occasional spooky monster, and you drop something like, a cartload of dead babies and hideous gore everywhere, there's going to be a mismatch. So work out what your players are expect and make sure everyone's on the same page.
So Ken, assuming that you've got a group of players who have reviewed the safety protocols and you're confident that you all like the same brand of horror, what would your top tip be?
My top tip is that, as you say, horror requires collective buy-in, and it requires it throughout the environment, because one person not into it, unlike, say, adventure, one person not into it actively spoils the mix. So you need to be aware of and involving and playing on every player at the table. You can, if you're a good GM and you've got a good rapport with your player, you can often build a solo story that still involves and scares the other players for them to watch for a bit. So the bit where someone goes down to the basement alone, that's great, but you have to make sure that it's scary enough that spectators are also scared by it. And the best way to maintain that is to manipulate tension and pacing at the table. The best way to do that is with the old roller coaster structure. And the roller coaster, of course, it begins normal. Everyone's climbing in. The kid's like, strap in. It's very unsafe. And then tick, 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 tick. Tension ramps up. You start noticing that, oh my God, that guy seemed very young to be working a roller coaster and possibly, on meth. I'm not sure that was these are all rusted up. Is that wood? I don't think this roller coaster is very well maintained. Tick, 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 tick. More and more things impress upon you. This was a terrible idea to ride this stupid roller coaster. And then you get to the very top and you have a moment of clarity where the scope of the problem is revealed to you. And then you drop down in terrifying vertigo. And if you can get that pace, that structure, that model going at the table, that will reliably produce horror. It may not produce the absolute best horror that you're capable of, but it is the fallback mechanism for making horror happen at the table.
One bit of advice I would give for creeping out your players is to pay attention to what they react to. Horror players who are there for that genre are going to signal what they find enjoyably creepy. And they're going to react to it. They're going to riff about it. They're going to joke about it. And once you find a little detail in the beginning, and often I find that there are certain like horror genre movies where I'm always find the early acts of those films more frightening than the actual climax. For example, a lot of the ghost movies or the sort of real-time security cam footage, the first act often has a really creepy little simple moment where a thing just sort of moves and there's a sudden shift, but then they can't pay that off. As role players, you know that you have a cool scene at the end that is going to pay off. So you can bring in that slow burn at the beginning with just little details that are just slightly off. And often those things are much more, unnerving than the scythe coming out of nowhere or the more overt horror imagery, and often things that combine mundane detail of the real world with something that is just slightly off. So, the idea that, you come back into the hotel room where you've been conducting your poltergeist investigation, and you find that there's just a series of matchbox cars, all kind of rusty and covered in dirt, and they're arranged on the bedspread in an Ouroboros pattern. Now, there's no overt threat there, although in many games there is a threat because you can ask the players to make a composure or stability or sanity test, whatever it is in your game. And that can cost them a resource. And that's a useful mechanic to measure, to make the fear of the characters an ebbing resource that then causes the players to feel unease. But start off with just the sort of left field things that they don't expect, and then that gives you a place to work from. And it may be that the dirty matchbox cars are much more terrifying to them than the giant swirling poltergeist ghost graveyard monster that you've designed for the final scene. So next I want to ask each of my panelists to come up with a moment from their GMing experience where they really succeeded in creating something creepy for their players, and just what techniques they use. What did they either deliberately set out to do or stumble into that created that mood of horror that had them talking about the game afterwards? Gar?
Were the few times I've ever been really, really scared in a role-playing game, and this is many, many years ago, a friend of mine was running a one-shot game where we were playing ourselves. And we were, I think the key tip here is run games when your players are really, really sleep deprived. Because as you've described, like, a monster outside the room we were in, I was also staring at the door, and you can almost see the players trying to remember which bit of this is real, which bit of this is fictional. And obviously, I'm not going to like advise getting your players into altered states of mind or whatever, but I think a lot of the time horror does work well when the players are strung out. So often, the scenes where if the players are tired or at the end of a long session, you can have a scene there which can be a good time for a scary jump scare or something. And the players have sort of let their guard down a bit.
Ken, can you remember a particular moment that you helped create and how you did it?
This is not, to narrow it down, because I'm blessed with a couple of players that are very easily scared at the table. And when they become scared, that feeds into the other players. And so any time that the characters go underground, one of my players will go, just knows that underground is terrible, doesn't want to be underground. I don't think she's claustrophobic in real life, but she's seen a lot of horror films, so she knows nothing good ever comes of going underground. So she's already hyped up and tensed up, and then that communicates to the other players. But I think the last time that I deliberately put a landmine under them, it was a ripoff from M.R. James from the story Count Magnus. They were in a crypt. They broke it into a crypt because they decided that the guy buried in it was a sorcerer, and guess what? He was. And so they break into his crypt, and as they're talking, they say the name of the sorcerer. And so one of the locks on the crypt falls off. One of the locks on the coffin falls off. And I begin with, you hear a clatter, and then they go around and they look, and one of the locks has fallen off. They don't know that it happened when they said the name. And so then they're like, oh my God, could something have happened? I mean, it could Silas still be up? And then when they said Silas, they saw the lock just shiver and fall off the coffin. And they were like, and then, of course, I had some NPCs begin to show up, another rival band of crypt investigators. And you could hear them coming, and you could hear their voices just sort of indistinctly in the distance. And they're walking forward, and I can say you can sort of see their flashlights playing around outside the crypt door. And there was literally a brief whispered discussion: should we shut the crypt door with ourselves inside to prevent them from coming in? And just as they've gotten themselves keyed up at that, one of the NPCs says, here it is, Silas Barnaby, reading the name off the top of the crypt from outside. And then I said, you hear a clatter. And they jumped 5 inches off the chairs because they were so keyed up waiting for this moment. And then, of course, the coffin lid begins to slide back. And literally, there was no way that I could have described anything in that coffin that was worse than the moment that third lock had hit. But when that third lock hit, it was a absolute perfect landmine of horror where you've foreshadowed it, you've laid it, and then they were helpless to prevent it without making their lives a million times worse. It was a very nice dilemma horn, but it's very rarely that your players will volunteer to go into the crypt with no other precautions.
Ruth, what is your sort of signal horror moment?
I think one of the real unsettling ones for my players reminds me of something that I said yesterday in the Yellow King role-playing game, although it was not at all Yellow King related. It was they were facing a dark young in a forest, and I'd given them various clues about the situation and everything else. And they had all these ideas about an underground monster or something a little color out of spacey or everything. And they had just sort of forgotten that trees could move. So one of them ends up getting grabbed, and then there's some debate, like, do we go back and save? Like, some people are like, we are just getting out of here, and he is going to be in the tree. The tree is running off with this character. And it was just, they were stalking this thing, and they weren't sure what they were stalking. And then it turned out to be the tree. And that just really, it was a great example of where they were expecting certain kind of monster, certain kind of thing. And no, everything was inherently consistent as well with it being a dark young. And trees can travel, and trees can really mess you up.
And that's a great example of the technique where you take something ordinary in the environment and then make it horrible. Another great technique for fear comes to mind in a couple of instances in my extended Yellow King game, all about isolation, of having the characters having to be stuck in a isolated place where there's nobody else around, no one to help them, where they are alone. And very briefly, the Yellow King has 4 different time periods / realities that it's set in, and you play different iterations or comments upon the characters each time. And in the second sequence, The Wars, which is set in an alternate reality war in 1947 Europe, the characters were assigned to go and hold an old fortress. And they got there, and there were enemy forces in there that they had to clear out. But the rest of the scenario was just, they're in this place. They have to be there, and there's stuff out in the darkness coming at them. And the actual horror of the game, like in terms of like what the monsters were and everything, I assumed that the players would then have their characters leave the fortress to explore the area, but they just hunkered down. And you would think that that would make everything boring, but in fact, the tiniest little details and changes in their environment just really, really freaked them the heck out. And so that went very well. And then later in the fourth sequence, This Is Normal Now, which is set in a sort of a version of our actual contemporary world, the horrible thing that time was just the night became permanent all around the world, and they knew that they had done something to make that happen. And so they decided, where are we going to go? How are we going to deal with this? And someone said, well, my aunt's got a cottage up in the woods. Let's go there. And they had given me the most amazing gift. They were now deliberately choosing to recapitulate the thing that had scared the socks off them in the previous scenario, and go off into the woods yet again, and to be alone and stuck without anyone there to help them. So at this point, if you haven't done so already, folks watching this, if you have a question, please pop it in the chat. We're going to move to questions now, because I see we've got a lot of really excellent questions. And one of them was, in fact, one I had on my list to get to anyway. So this question is, can you talk about audio or other senses to create a horrific and fun experience? Ruth, are you an audio-visual horror GM?
Not too much, but I was thinking of another example, which is unfortunately a spoiler for my most recent scenario in the Black Star Magic. But I will say, using at least a certain amount of visual description and prompting beforehand prompting with images such as, I don't know, some innocent clown stuff, can get people's minds ready for when they encounter some really over-the-top clown stuff.
Gar, do you use music or sound effects?
Sometimes. I do find that because horror is all about creating atmosphere, that audio can work very, very well. I find it like hard to manage in the middle of play, so I've started doing lately is just, there are a couple of soundtracks on like Spotify of basically just spooky noises. It's this very like unobtrusive, not even background music, but the occasional sort of creak or like, you know, weird musical cue. Possibly a more prepared GM could, like, you know, tie the particular scenes. But I find just having something that occasionally sort of disturbs the players, makes them shiver a bit in the background, just reminds them that, you know, we're playing a horror game. If the players think I should be scared, it helps, you know, scaring them.
I will sometimes use music soundtracks. The thing, though, is they have to be really well curated, because if you're just grabbing a bunch of horror tracks and putting them on random, sometimes something will come up that may be great in its context, but just breaks the mood. So, for example, the brilliant soundtracks to Italian giallo movies can sometimes take you far astray, because all of a sudden there'll just be like a party music snippet in the middle of what you think is a horror cut. I have also sometimes used sound effects to evoke sort of a particular recurring horror. So In the war sequence, I use the sound of the boîte noire, the strange typewriter-like communication devices that they use. And so whenever they started to hear their orders come in from the front, from HQ, that was a moment of focusing attention and being scared. And also the players met some scary foxes. That was just a throwaway thing on my part, but they really latched onto those. And so someone in the group observed that the cry of foxes can be quite distressing. So I quickly found a fox sound effect, and I kept playing that again and again. It became the leitmotif of the entire year and a half cross reality game. And whenever they heard foxes, they just knew they developed, a Pavlov's fox response to having that happen. So I think what we're all saying is that if you use them sparingly, they can be extremely effective. The next question, and the reason I'm not asking Ken is because I know he does not use sound that much. How do you maintain tension and suspense? I feel like I run games with horror themes and topics, but it's difficult to maintain horror in the actual atmosphere in the game. And so, Ken, this gets back to the roller coaster ticking up that you were talking about. Can you be a bit more specific about how you institute that?
Yeah, the goal is to give things that either just indicate wrongness, give details of the story, give details that happen around the characters that either just indicate wrongness, the entrance into the uncanny, or that specifically hint at, point to, prefigure, foreshadow the horrors to come. So if you're in your poltergeist game and you have ghosts manipulating thing and it's about childhood trauma, you're bit with a rusted out Matchbox cars is a great example. That's something that is it's evocative. If you know the ending, you'll recognize that it's a big payoff because the kid used to play with his Matchbox cars, et cetera, and then and it indicates you're not on the sidewalk anymore. You're out in the dangerous supernatural street, and trouble could happen. So just to have either from watching horror movies yourself or thinking about the circumstances of your game or the big bad, the monster, the creepy thing, have indications of what are spoor in your head. What is the horror reveal itself as before you get to it? And just if you're going through and you're sensing the players are sort of drifting around, they're maybe making side chat, they're not paying attention, drop in the next thing on your spoor list. So if you began with the Matchbox cars, the next thing is the sound of maybe it's the sound of a merry-go-round going around. You hear the sound of a carousel weirdly echoing from your phone on the table there. That's weird. You turned your phone off when you went in because you know that ghosts can ride on electronic waves. That's odd. And then that will be oh my God, my phone possessed. What's the carousel doing? And then as that leads them into the horror, they will then be more alert for things to be going wrong, which means you can then give them more things that are going wrong. And ideally, you create a situation where their eagerness to not be caught by surprise will allow you to catch them, to at least shock them, if not surprise them, as you go closer and closer to the actual horror moment, the big drop, if you will, of the roller coaster.
So
Ruth, how do you manage pacing out tension?
I was just thinking of one of the things that I had done similar to what Ken described, where it went horribly wrong and that it ramped up the tension more than I was prepared for at that moment. But it went really well in that it really ramped up the tension that they'd brought themselves back to this safer place. And I did something a little unsettling by having a mouth open up in the wall. It was thematic.
Just a little unsettling.
Anyway, they accidentally became possessed, convinced that they were possessed. There were other factors. So anyway, they kind of took us almost to the end scene tension. So I actually had to figure out then how to ride that along, which was surprisingly challenging because when you've accidentally amped it way up, you don't have your roller coaster. It's like somebody put a little heart spike in there. And so what I had to end up doing was coming up with, I think in general, like coming up with either little seeds or additional threats which keep them from being able to find a place where they go to ground, because that was sort of their initial response was to seek to flee, to seek to go to ground. And so what I had to do was make it sort of be that nowhere was safe, but following the clues to get the answers seemed like it could be both the most dangerous and the only way that they could resolve these tensions. And so I think it's important to give your players space for downtime, but it's important not to give them too much space for downtime, which is my more general method of doing that, is making sure that there are other factors in play besides the horror so that they don't feel comfortable just stopping in one place. And I think that's slightly genre based as well, as more detective noir type fiction.
Gar.
I think basically, I was supposed to say this. It's okay to fail sometimes at it. I mean, role-playing games are sort of like a very hard to predict combination of factors. On some nights, your players will be in the mood, like all the scenes will fall as planned, you role-play really well, and it'll be terrifying. Next night, just you get the scary part, someone's phone rings or the pizza arrives, and that particular session sort of falls down. To get a real hard role-play game, all the factors have to align. And all you can do as a GM is basically keep practicing, keep trying to build atmosphere, build tension, but don't get stressed about it. Don't feel that every game session is going to be a scary experience. Not every game is going to work at the table every time.
And your players may not be fully signaling just how creeped out they are, so that you may be doing a better job than you think. A thing to do, though, if they do seem to be getting too complacent, or you've had too many just sort of mundane scenes of investigation in a row, is kind of come up with a list of weird manifestations. And we've mentioned a bunch of creepy foxes, mouths opening up in walls, matchbox toys, whatever it is. Think of things that can happen at any time, regardless of where they are, and just sort of have things in your back pocket that you can drop out. So it's like, well, I don't need these dogs with human faces to show up at any point in this scenario. But if I need them, I can have them appear here or here or here, so that you've got ways to escalate the tension that are perhaps secondary to what the main manifestation is. But it's always great to have the idea that, a bunch of things are going wrong in this place. There's one main problem, but it has some psychic backwash effect. So, the rampaging lycanthropes that are the main antagonists in your scenario, well, just their presence may cause weird lunar effects or whatever it is. Come up with a way to be able to have something that is free floating and drop in at any time. And in the gumshoe horror games, we call that the antagonist reaction, sort of free floating things that you can pop in when you need them to sort of goose the tension as you go along. The next question is, this is the opposite problem that we were talking about, is how do you manage expectations where the players are expecting something more terrifying than what you had planned for them? Is that even hard, Ken?
Again, what Gar was saying sort of comes in here, that gaming is collaborative. Gaming is everybody's got to be on their job. And if your players have been, scaring themselves with their ideas of what's coming next, steal that idea. I was during the alpha playtest of Night's Black Agents. They were in Naples, and I was just describing Naples, sort of the, travelogue, opening Chiron segment. And I mentioned there was a super tanker at anchor in the harbor, just to sort of give the sense of a grimy industrial setting. And one of the players said, if that super tanker is full of blood, I'm going to be very, very angry. And well, at that moment, that super tanker became full of blood, and it became, how did the relatively restrained vampire conspiracy that I already had in Naples, what did it need a super tanker full of blood for? How could I make that happen? How soon can I get them down to the waterfront to find bloody footsteps and hoses that are sort of bulging and clotting and that kind of thing. And if they come up with something more terrifying, they almost always will have shared that during their I hope it's not X moment. And then your job is just, oh no, it's X plus 2. That's how bad it is. Yeah. I mean, never say, "Oh no, you know what? It was just the wind. That was just me. it was the cat." You should be ready for whatever they're wanting not to face.
Gar, have you ever had to deal with players who were expecting something worse than you planned for them?
I can think of couple of situations where I have this long-term plot planned out, and they build up like some minor villain or some minor monster into more than they think it is. And if I'm not prepared to, as Ken suggests, I basically change things on the fly for some reason, then the best thing to do there is to be fairly ambiguous in my descriptions. So if there's this bit with, say, a dog in a ruin, and the players have convinced themselves that it's this creepy hellhound, how the basket build monster, it's going to grab them and drag them off to hell or something. And I know that for the plot to work, it is just an ordinary dog. Then I'll describe it in such a way that sort of feeds into their growing paranoia and fear about what they're going to meet, and basically let them scare themselves without changing the plot. So basically cut down my own description of what they're facing and let them fill in the blanks.
I'm trying to paraphrase this question just a little because other parts of it we've kind of addressed already. So does a horror scenario always have to sort of transition from fear of the unknown and unease and the sort of creepy imagery we've been discussing? Does there need to be a big fight with a big monster at the end, or are there other ways to satisfyingly conclude a horror scenario? Ruth?
I think that there doesn't have to necessarily be a big fight with a big monster, but there has to be some sort of large. Sorry, I'm looking at it again. I think that it may almost be having to deal with the small, unsettling details that can be harder. So, if you put your big monster fight somewhere 2/3 of the way through, but find a way in which that leaves open doors, gateways, tunnels, the little things like that, where sometimes the best ending of a horror game is knowing that you've resolved the problem here, but that the problem continues. I am a huge fan of ghouls, as I have mentioned and written about. And so, for example, there, ghoul tunnels, little hints of things that come in elsewhere as you're resolving your issue, which especially with ghouls can be extremely mundane and very basic and very straightforward. But it's also one of the best ways I found to really seed it out that you can't actually do anything against this on the cosmic scale. And that people still find very unsettling, whether they're dealing with the ghouls in an Egyptian context or in the American South or under London, something like that. It's leaving open unsettling and odd factors can help in a post-climax thing where there are still issues to resolve. So I would say you don't have to put all your eggs in one big climax, but whatever your ending is, you can let the players resolve this problem, this scenario at this time, but maybe you find ways to leave it open in a way that leaves everyone thinking, oh, this is not great.
I will still put fights at the end of many scenarios, but I've increasingly found over the years that people don't actually need that. And there are other things that can create a sense of resolution at the end. If it's a investigative horror game, just finding out what the solution is to the mystery, and often the players, if they find some way to counteract it, like a ritual or something, and so it could be that you're attempting to enact whatever it is that will open the gate that sends the thing back into the other dimension, or it can be a terrifying psychic revelation, a chase scene where you get away. That's classic horror, right? And you want to in some way indicate, I think, that the physical threat has been countered, but that could just easily be they drop a car on him using a piece of construction equipment, or they finally succeed in running it over enough times with a bus, or they the classic, they throw the dynamite down in the mine and they're all blown out of the mine at the last minute. As long as there's something big, I think it doesn't have to be a fight, and big can be psychic rather than physical as well. Gar, what's your stance on the big monster fight at the end?
Yeah, I mean, you do need a sort of a final resolution to that particular event. You need to, like, right, guys, this thing has been resolved, this problem has been resolved. But yeah, it is always lovely to sort of, pan away and see, the monster left eggs behind, or there's this, entrance to a ghoul tunnel, this shaft leading down to the depths. If you go down there, you'll be devoured whole. So you'd kill the one ghoul that climbed up to the surface, or the spooky child or something. Basically give the players a feeling that there could be a sequel almost, that they haven't completely plumbed the mystery.
Ken, do you have favorite non-fighty horror resolutions in mind?
Yeah, I mean, if you have a monster that's the cause of the horror, by and large, the characters are going to want to fight it, or they're going to want to do something, even if it's not a direct fight. They're going to want to, throw dynamite into its hole and hope for the best. So I find that if you are worried that you're leaning on that structure too much, and again, there's no such thing as a bad formula as long as everyone's enjoying the formula. If the fights themselves are different, the monsters are refreshingly weird, there's plenty of ghoul tunnels leading off at the end. One of my favorite things whenever they've fought ghouls in my ongoing Fall of Delta Green game is that they'll have some NPC that they are sure was dead, often because they killed them, show up in the news afterward, just in footage, or they, have a surveillance photo that shows them still walking around. And then they're, oh my God, the ghouls ate his corpse and are now impersonating him. This is the worst. But often you can have a thing that is just sort of a mythos leftover, or a uncanny event that simply solving the mystery resolves. And I did that with a story set in a haunted amusement park. Indeed, that old classic. There was an amusement park in Massachusetts called Norumbega Park. That was a big Viking-themed amusement park that got shut down in the 60s. And so I decided it was built on an actual, Viking menhir that was on a ley line, and the deep ones were using it. And they'd been brought in to investigate weird events at the park. They'd sort of got some notion of time slips somehow connected to the fate of the USS Thresher. They get out the fire bombs to bomb the thing that they think is the menhir. And of course, they're throwing the fire bombs at the menhir, and then they're hearing over their radio as they're listening for EVP, the people on the Thresher broadcasting forward in time saying, "Where are these fires coming from? Oh my God, this is terrible." And they realize that basically they caused the phenomenon that they were investigating. That's a lovely ending. You can't always count on characters to throw firebombs at the time gate, although now that I say that out loud, you absolutely can always count on that. But if you offer an opportunity in which the players are the problem they're trying to solve, that's a great one, and it is very opposite of just keep shooting the ghouls and hope that you didn't, run out of solid slug shotgun ammo.
So the next question is about online play. How many of my panelists are running online games at the moment? Okay.
Running, playing, and
yes. So this one is about how to use private chat messages now that that's a thing. Ruth, how have you found a use for that?
I think it is one of the best ways. And actually, I'd been running online play before COVID because one of my player groups lives all over the US. It's a really great way sometimes to send people notes that say something along the lines of, actually, what you see is blank. And we talked a little bit about this in the Yellow King panel yesterday, but really undermining their sense of reality, especially if they're not. Are they the ones being am I lying to them, or am I lying to the rest of the party? And that's a thing that sort of has to get done out. So sometimes it's really good for the party to say that, to turn to the person and say, actually, you see that this 80-year-old woman is secretly something, or she's got wings under that jacket. No, she's totally normal. I don't know what they're on about. But sometimes you really want to pass that. So I think using it to undermine the sense of reality is a particularly good one for a horror game.
Gar, Ruth took my answer, so what's yours?
But shows all took mine to a degree. The one thing I'd add is that what I found really useful is if a player has, or a character has some condition or quirk, like for example, one player in a Five Rings game around many, many years ago picked up this evil scroll. And they knew that opening the scroll would release this basically the big bad of the campaign and it'd be terrible, and then you don't open the scroll. And every so often in the game, I would just go over to that player and whisper and went, open it, open it. So you do something very, very similar with chat messages. Like, so if a character has a weird encounter with a spider god or something, you just every so often, even in random unrelated scenes, so a quick message, you see spiders on the wall. You feel something running down your spine. Oh, look, legs. Just basically just poke a player to react.
The next question is, do you have advice for doing horror scenarios in games where the characters are normally fairly empowered, like fantasy or superhumans? And I'll kick it off with the obvious answer, which is that something about the horror changes their sense of empowerment. So they're, famously in DC Comics, right? Superman is vulnerable to magic. It is, Iron Man has no ability to fight ghosts. That whatever the horror is something that takes these characters who normally feel reasonably invulnerable and puts them in a situation where their ordinary powers either don't help or are perhaps completely counterproductive, right? If you use your flame powers, then the ghost can take the flame and put it wherever they want. Ken?
A lot of horror is about powerlessness, but the trouble with running powerless, superpowered characters is it sort of breaks the initial premise of the campaign. I mean, no one minds one part of one scenario. Oh, it's a red sun, you can't use your powers. But if that happens every time, they will legitimately kick back. So you need to threaten other things that they hold dear. I mean, that's the role of Jimmy Olsen or Robin in the story, is to be the thing that is threatened, so that a normally invulnerable character has to feel a sense of vulnerability and a sense of interest in it. Another thing, obviously, is to, in a longer term campaign or a campaign that is intended to be about existential horror, the source of their power may turn out to be bad. Oh, I got my power from the cosmic energy of the stars. I'm Starman. It's like, the stars, eh? If they come righter, you'll get more power. That'd be great, wouldn't it? You'd be able to do so much good if the stars just came a little right. That'd be terrific. And then you could either, lure them into, increasing their power through dubious means. The old demonic pact, the dark side mechanic in the old Star Wars game was great for that. Or you can simply have a slow reveal that, oh yeah, the cosmic rod that you got, that's got a femur in it. You didn't know that. It was your old boss. The old Starman, you thought he made that in his lab, but nope, it's got a femur in it. That's wild. I wonder whose femur that is. That's not going to be a good answer. So if they begin to think, oh, actually, not just with great power comes great responsibility, with great power comes great vulnerability, then that, keeps the surface story the same, but drills a good horror shaft underneath it.
So the next question is about using the meta game, the world surrounding the game, the world of the players and the GM rather than the characters, to create horror. And the example here is saying, are you trying to do that quietly? Which is, I think, in between those two spaces. Are there ways to leverage things at the table to increase the fright that the players, if not the characters, are feeling? Gar?
I'm trying to think. You can certainly undermine a player's certainty. This almost sort of like loops back to Ruth's description of basically using sort of auto-description, like the player goes, I opened the door, and Jim was finding it up, And then a moment or two later, the GM says, "Oh, and like but the door is closed." And players go, "Wait, I opened it." Like, did you? That can work occasionally, but it gets frustrating in the long term. I mean, any sort of messing with the metagame, if done to excess, is going to basically either slow the game down a huge amount or just make the players frustrated. So I'd be cautious about doing it.
Ruth, do you ever stoop to metagame scares?
I've been trying to think, and offhand, I think the most is really just making sure about some things about the atmosphere, but no, not otherwise.
Classic examples, of course, are rolling dice for no reason, printing out a terrifying map and leaving it out for your players to see, even though you have no intention of bringing it into play in the game. One of the condition cards in the Yellow King role-playing game, if you suffer a particular shock, you are then lose health points anytime any player cracks a joke. So the other players then have to either watch their banter or don't watch their banter in order to keep your character from being harmed. And that's, I think, pretty far on the edge of metagaming. Ken, do you muck with that?
The old "you can try" is legendary in my campaigns for, "Oh, this is much worse than it looks," as my answer. Sometimes it's an obviously dumb question, but sometimes they're asking a question and I say, "You can try," and that's the equivalent of a horror sting in the moment where they're like, "Oh, something weird is going on." In terms of using the metagame, there's obviously the old I used to use individual dice as the miniatures in sort of tabletop. This is what the combat area looks like, and you take out a bunch of dice and you pile them here, and then you take 4 of them out and put them down. That's a good little signal that there's more to this battle than you think is going to happen. By and large, scaring players with the metagame deliberately takes bandwidth for me that could be spent scaring them with the fiction. And if I accidentally scare them with the metagame, great, but I don't really go out of my way to plot, except in the way that I know that, Emily will react badly if her character has to go underground. So even if nothing is going to happen underground, I make sure to say, "Oh, that's weird. That floor sounded weirdly hollow when you walked over it. Maybe there's a sub-basement you don't know about in this building." And that's not really metagaming in the sense that you could argue even in the fiction, her character is paranoid about, enclosed spaces and going underground. So they would be responding to the stimuli differently. But in terms of sort of laying traps with table technique, by and large, I can be thinking of weird spoor and cool effects with that same brain. And that's, I think, a bigger payoff.
So the next question plays right into our promotional hands by asking, what systems do you prefer for horror? Classic systems like D20 or Cthulhu, or indie systems like Dread? And you may have heard that many of our credits are with the Gumshoe system. And Gar, do you want to extol its virtues as sort of a stripped down but still kind of trad game that's a midway point in the spectrum we've just been presented with?
The Gumshoe system is based on investigation. Gives the players a set of abilities for gathering clues and gives them basically a clear and very wide vocabulary for basically asking questions. Instead of having a spot skill and a research skill, that's it. You've got lots of very specialist abilities, which gives the GM lots of ways to hand you weird stuff and strange clues. And it's mechanically very, very simple, but sort of a rich vocabulary. In terms of more sort of India systems like Dread with its wonderful Jenga stuff, I like it for one shot, but I would find it wearing to run a campaign of it.
Ruth, your systems of choice for horror?
Yeah, Yeah, I think much like Gar, I have greatly enjoyed a few Dread one-shots. I'm kind of clumsy, so that makes it a slightly more tense experience in a different way, a slightly distracting way, which is, I think, one of the reasons that I like Gumshoe is that it has both aspects of the role-playing game, and that you have skills so that you have points that you can do this investigation and get the clues. And I definitely find it more frustrating when I'm rolling and I can't get the clue, even though I know the clue is there. That does really frustrate me when I'm playing in other people's systems and we're doing something investigative. And the GM has chosen not to bring in that Gumshoe ethos. But I do like that it still has that dice rolling element for when things go horribly wrong, because in a horror game, you need that thing, whether it's the Jenga tower falling or whether it's rolling a 1. You need that moment to take the stakes and either lift the mood or crash it to the ground. So I those are two that come to mind. I've been trying to think if there's other system level systems versus one-off games that I particularly recommend.
We have a request for a term clarification. Can you mention the dilemma horn? What is that? And are there any other plot or story devices that work well like that?
That was shorthand for the old horns of a dilemma, where player characters or players find themselves ideally between two equally unappealing choices, but their constraints have been bent down so that they have to do one or the other. In this case, should we let these new people come in because we know they're going to say Silas, or should we shut ourselves up in the crypt with 2/3 of the locks gone on this necromancer? And so that sort of thing where whatever choice they make will ruin them, but it's their choice and they have to make it, is an ideal circumstance from a GM perspective. In terms of other sorts of scenarios in which you have those options, I think that you can think of basic stuff like a bottle episode. You're all trapped in a building and you have to solve some interpersonal problem at the same time you have to solve the external problem, or in order to solve the external problem. Anything that works well over and over and over in drama, even down to the you only have one bullet, who do you shoot question. Those are standards for a reason. And I've said over and over and over, playing from within a cliche does not feel cliched to the same extent that watching a cliche unfold on television feels cliched. So feel free to lean on those old horror structures, the zombie infection bite that's coming, whatever it happens to be. If it makes the character make a real choice and thus forces the player to make a real choice, it's probably going to be productive of really good role-playing and ideally real horror.
We've got a couple of questions about what to do to show mastery in horror as a player. How do you contribute horror to the game as a player? And be the GM's friend by moving briskly toward the scary thing. So you can help the pacing of the adventure by sort of guiding everyone else in the group toward a decision. Play a character who has a reason to go into the horror movie situation. Somebody is going to play the person who doesn't want to do anything and wants to turtle. That character can be fun if they have you to ping off of, and if you're persuasive enough to get them off to do the thing. And also have a character who is scared. You're moving forward, but you are also terrified. Gar?
Yeah, I mean, basically, look for the role in the group that isn't being played. If no one is delving into the mystery, then be the one who investigates. If one player is sort of clearly going, the supernatural explanation for all this, then maybe they want a sort of like a Scully to their Mulder, and so they want someone to go, no, this is all like perfectly rational. Like this is like spooky and strange, but I'm sure there's a rational explanation out there if we just find it. So you can they want someone to argue at the moment. So look for what's not being done and do that.
So Ruth, how do you want players to bring an apple for the teacher? How can they make the game more enjoyably scary?
Well, I really appreciate it when, I think, building sort of on what Gar said, if you think about an ensemble cast and what would be in a good TV show, pick in one of those roles that would be in a good horror film or a good TV show or something that you like in the genre. And also, on that note, communicate what you like and what you are looking for in a game to the GM outside of the time and ahead of time, and communicate when you are scared. I think that is very helpful. So yeah, and then building on Robin's, nobody lives forever. It is really okay if your character dies horribly, but in a really interesting way. So be okay poking and prodding.
We have a question about immersion breaking moments, about when you are citing the rules in a game, like, for example, say, roll for sanity. Does that break the mood of the horror game, or is that something that players just sort of read through and take as a given? Ken?
I mean, if it's no mechanic breaks play if they know the mechanic well, and it's easy to know a mechanic well if it's super simple. Roll a sanity check is dirt simple. Roll and compare it to your stat. Oh, you're under, you're good, you're over, you're not good. The same thing with a stability check in Gumshoe. As stability check is a little winkier because the GM knows the difficulty, the player doesn't necessarily. But by and large, once they've internalized, it's 4 for normal things and 5 for Cthulhu Mythos-y things, or 5 in the pitch dark in Nice Black Agents. Then that moves forward. It becomes a transparent effect. No more than roll to hit breaks immersion in combat. I think players, as I think it was, the Ruth says, you need that moment where things can go horribly pear-shaped by randomness. The roll is actually their contribution to that. They're leaving themselves hostage to that force. So I don't think it breaks mood at all. I think that the act of rolling enhances it. And as long as you don't have to think about which dice am I rolling, what sub-table do I check that on, if the GM knows the system well enough to guide them, or they know the system well enough to do it, it doesn't break immersion any more than anything else does.
A well-designed rule will, in fact, enhance the emotion of whatever it is that you're trying to do. And in the case of a horror game, the having to roll creates a moment of suspense. And in Gumshoe, having to roll a general ability and decide how many extra points to add to it also creates unease and uncertainty, and that is baked into it. So I think that people just tend to look at that as sort of an invisible thing, like a lens flare on a camera, right? You've really got to J.J. Abrams your rules mechanics for people to notice them.
If I could I add one last thing on it, which is, I think a concrete way to do that is knowing what the roles are as the GM and narrating it, right? You don't say, well, you might say, roll me sanity. But if you're concerned about this, what you might say is, ooh, you might want to grab that D6 and think about, and give me a whatever check or something. Like, you might want to pick up those D10s and let's roll some, and just narrate it in a way that maybe prompts them to do the specific thing if they're a little unsure on the system, so that, again, it doesn't break the flow of, wait, what is the thing? And you don't have that side conversation. Tell them what to do and narrate it into what you're doing. As they poke the thing, open the door. I open the door. Ooh, yeah, grab dice and roll me sanity.
Actually, one thought I had there, you could steal from 13th Age. In 13th Age, you got the escalation die, which is like, the specific D6 that gives you a bonus. You could have a specific sanity die, and which is only used by the group to roll sand checks or skill checks. And when that comes up in play, you slide it over to the player, so they know, when that dice comes to them, that they're going to make a check. You can just say it then.
You get one of those great black with the red highlights in it, Chessex dice. Use that as your thing. It's like, roll the death die.
So we have a question about keeping games moving when the players suffer from analysis paralysis. And that's basically the syndrome when they are really intent on the right answer, but this is not a tactical game, it's an investigation. But the point of the investigation is just to draw you further into the danger. And the technique I would suggest for that is to, when you find that they don't know what to do, there surely is not a right answer, but a right-ish answer, at least one that leads them further into the story. And so as GM over the years, I've become more explicit about just being a moderator for them and kind of guiding them through and saying, So what I'm hearing is that you've got three choices, that you can either go down to the basement of the library, or you can head out to the swamp, or you can attempt again to get that weird professor with the third eye to tell you what's really going on. And so the reason often people get analysis paralysis is not just because they want to be absolutely right, but because they don't like any of the choices, because it's a horror game, you've made them scary. Ruth, how do you deal with analysis paralysis in horror?
I think after, as well as recapping them back, simply saying, so what I'm hearing is you are looking between these two, which do you do first? And sort of prompting them on to the next one, and again, acting as that moderator.
So the next question is, how do you get better at describing scary scenes? Are there good adjectives to have on hand? Ken, are you you have adjectives at your fingertips? How did you internalize all of those horror words?
Well, I mean, part of it is just read a lot of Lovecraft, but the other, I mean, one of the things you can do is describe the scenes in ways that are not often described. And a technique that is remarkably underutilized for how powerful it is to describe what the scene smells like. No one ever does that. No one walks into the dungeon and says, "What do I smell?" But that is something that will hit you as a human being if you go into a murder house or a ghoul tunnel or whatever. Anytime you can describe an odor, that immediately provides just a shortcut to their lizard brain. And if you can describe it in terms that are unpleasant or taboo, so it smells like, clotted blood, it smells like rotting meat, it smells like something bad, but you still have to walk into it, that sets up a reaction that I think, it's almost an ingrained evolutionary reaction. I don't think players are even voluntarily aware that they're doing it, but it builds mood very, very economically, and it's something that almost nobody does. They certainly very seldom write it into published scenarios, and I don't think a lot of people do it at the table, and I think it's such a payoff for so little effort.
Ruth, description, how do you master it?
I think, well, since Ken sort of took one of my methods, I think also reading a lot and knowing what actually sounds scary versus what sounds over the top versus what fits into your genre. So you may not want to say squamous all the time, and you may want to look up what squamous means because it's not necessarily what you think. So either leaning in on the tropes because it fits in that moment, or just reading so that you have a broader lexicon. I'm trying to think, but it's rather late, so I'm not coming up with, but your favorite horror authors and your favorite horror films, and get those descriptions and then work from there.
And also, less is more. That a couple of really telling images are a lot more effective than now I'm going to describe the pathway up the thing, and because you can sort of hit overload where people start to tune you out. So give a couple of really great sensory images, and as Ken points out, not just visual, but the others, and that will leave a stronger impression. Two things is better than 7. We've just hit about our hour mark, including the time when we started. So let's find one more sort of closing question. And so let's make that the one about the ringer. So the question is, how do you feel about one player in the game who functions as an inside man, either with the knowledge of a plot or with a dread secret that they have to unfurl? Let's start out with Ken on that.
I think that, again, horror depends on trusting your players. If that is something that is allowed or implied by your table contract, go with it. A player who wants to suffer, who wants to be a figure of danger, it's usually not, at least in my table, it's usually not someone who wants to hijack the game. It's someone who wants to make the game better. So I've had one of the best moments in my GMing career is when one of my players, as he's joining the Unknown Armies campaign, about halfway through, he says, "Can I be under my grandfather's blood curse but not know it?" That's a beautiful gift. That's just a very thoughtful gift to the GM. And so if a player says, "Yeah, I think I want to be descended from the werewolf tribe," or in my backstory as an MI6 agent, I was renditioned in Romania, and I don't remember 48 hours of my past. That's beautiful. That's a lovely thing to have happen. And then that player is cooperating with making things scarier for the whole group. You have to be willing then to kill them out and let them understand that, by and large, if you are a symptom of the horror, you will be cleansed with fire because you've met everyone else at the table. You know how this works. And if they're okay with it, then that's just the story. And it's a good story. And it does help prevent it's weird how no one in our Delta Green cell ever is awful or a betrayer or a heroin addict. That's very strange that it's literally everyone else we meet in the federal government that's like that. So if one of them, it turns out, oh yeah, no, I sold us all out to Hypnos when I was on heroin, then that's a bonus. That's a classic horror trope. And again, from the inside, it doesn't seem cliched. From the inside, it seems fun and challenging and horrible.
Gar, what use do you make of ringers?
Yeah, I mean, the trick is to make sure that the ringer doesn't dominate the game, that either that their story doesn't sort of become the story of the whole campaign, or the whole story, or that they know so much more that it's basically like, them versus the GM. Like, I remember many years ago, I wrote this convention scenario, which looked like a haunted house. One of the characters is a butler, and in the opening, you see the butler coughs, and in that moment, his mind is abducted by the Great Investigate. He's brought back in time. He's told that there's like a cosmic threat there. He's trained for years back in prehistory, and then returned to his original body with a knowledge of what's going on. And the purpose there, I thought, was to rally the players and have him sort of subtly guide them. But what actually happened in play was that player basically would always take over the table and be Van Helsing plus telling everyone what to do. So basically, make sure the inside man's inside knowledge isn't so great that they're the only one who has real agency and control the scenario.
Ruth, have you used ringers?
Yes, a little bit, and it's really playing to a person's strengths and interests, and I think that might be part of the key to making it work is, you don't give them the whole scenario like Gar said. It's more of this is happening, again, that back chat kind of thing where you actually let them know this is true. You are the only one who has got this role. You give everybody the info on a success, but they got such a good success that you give them a little bit extra. But it really depends on knowing that you can trust the player. So it's definitely not something, as Gar mentioned, not to do at a convention or somewhere where you don't know the people involved, but where you're leaning on that person's strengths, interests, or character history, right? You've come up with some little thing that would be amazing, fit with their character. So I think it's really a story by story and player by player thing where you have you come up with the perfect matches versus planting a ringer beforehand ahead of time or for the whole story.
I've used ringers in horror. I tend to prefer, rather than having you are working for the vampires or you're actually the Cthulhu cultist, is just have something that is an additional goal that will be a complication that will make, once revealed, will make the other players distrust you a little, but doesn't require them to shoot you and bury you in the backyard. So it may be, you're perfectly loyal to them and you want to accomplish all of the missions, but also you have this other thing that you want to do that may occasionally undermine them a little. And that, so that reveal is more interesting because it's in, wow, we didn't like that you did that, but you have helped us in this other way. And recently I got not only a rare opportunity to play a game rather than GM it, but I wound up with the ringer character, and Kat, who was at the same event, assumed that I had chosen it, but no, I was given this as the last character sheet, and so this was an assassin character in an Elric game, and no one in the group knew that I was an assassin. And the way I decided to handle that, so this is a tip for players, is to help everyone else accomplish their goals, and while also doing the horrible thing I was supposed to do, so that it was a matter of playing, first of all, the upper class twit character who I seemed to be, then revealed as the icy cold assassin, but also arrange everything so that they had reason to go along with me. And so that allowed them to both play the shock of having the ringer be discovered, but have it not break the outcome of the narrative. And, because that's the real challenge when you're assigned the ringer is, can I do this and survive? Can I accomplish all the goals? So as the GM, I think it would be fun to also create that possibility as well, where the person can be in league with whoever sort of kind of, but it's also still also sort of kind of on the player side. At this point, I would like to thank all of you for being on our side and sticking around this masterclass for as long as we've run it. And finally, I know that our magical Twitch sprites have been placing links into the chat. There is a convention 4 for 3 deal where if you buy 4 books at the Pelgrane web store, the cheapest one is free, which is what we would try to get you to do if you were at the Pelgrane booth. And so you can check out some of the many horror games that we've discussed tonight. From you can dip your toe in with Fear Itself. You can get into Modern Agents Against the Occult with the Esoterrorists, which has a sort of a trippy political side to it. There's Fall of Delta Green, which is our adaptation of the classic Delta Green setting set in the 1960s. There's the Yellow King role-playing game, which is a massive and ambitious game of reality horror. And there is also Trail of Cthulhu, which is our adaptation of the classic horror role-playing game, Call of Cthulhu. And so at this point, let's find out where we can find people online. Ruth, where can people find more from you and about you?
Well, you can find things that I've written and newer and older blog posts on the ArkhamArchivist.com. No the in front of it. It's a little late. And you can find me on Twitter as Ruth Burian.
It may be late for Ruth, but it's even later for you, Gar. Do you remember how people can find you?
In bed? No. Yeah, I mean, I'm Mytholder on Twitter, or GarethHanrahan.com will also find me.
And Ken, you can be located at?
I can be located at Kenneth Hite on Twitter, or as Kenneth Hite on Facebook, and I'm generally there pretty regularly. I will plug a non-Pelgrane book just to show that this is not a party politics broadcast. This is an open broadcast. So all of our gumshoe recommendations were made honestly, but everything I have to say about horror is pretty much in GURPS Horror 4th edition by me. So feel free to look at that if you want to answer about half the other questions in the panel, because I think I've written about them before.
And you can find the podcast that Ken and I do every week about horror and role-playing and many other things, including food, at Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff.com, or you can type in Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff into your podcast app of choice. You can support that podcast on our Patreon, or you can find me on Twitter at Robin D. Laws. And at this point, it is time for all of us to head back into the mist, get out on the rickety pier, get into the boat where surely nothing in the black water will claim us, and no sinister hands will come to grab us. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us for this. Tomorrow, we have at 11 a.m. a dramatic interaction masterclass. That's where we're going to talk about ways for you to get your player characters interacting with each other and creating exciting dramatic scenes. And at 2, there is a 13th Age monster creation workshop. So you can look up both of those events at GenCon.com for GenCon Online. and get the Twitch and or Zoom link for one or the other. So thanks again for joining us, everybody.